Now that I have the last page of my sermon, will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Through much of this season of Lent, we are sharing stories from the Gospel of John. John saw Jesus through a distinct lens. Let's call it a wide-angle lens. For him, Jesus is the essential revelation of God, the ultimate divine aha moment. And so he often tells stories of people whose encounter with Jesus opens their eyes. John loves to play with metaphors, dark and light, day and night, water, wind, and of course, sight. He loves to tell us stories about people who can't seem to recognize Jesus because something stands in their way, darkness or blindness or fear. Our story this week provides an interesting contrast to last week's story. Last week, you may remember, we met Nicodemus, the powerful religious leader who comes to Jesus under the cover of darkness, hungry for Jesus' wisdom, but not quite ready to receive it. Nicodemus was burdened by a narrow faith and a need for concrete answers. In the story today, we gather in broad daylight, at high noon, at the side of a well, and we meet a woman who is burdened by something else. Her heavy water jars indicate a thirst, not just for water, but for wholeness. Like Nicodemus, her issue is not physical, but spiritual. But she responds to Jesus in a very different way. In fact, there are a lot of differences between Nicodemus and this woman, not the least of which is Nicodemus has a name. Nicodemus is a powerful Jewish leader and insider. This woman is a poor, marginalized Samaritan, an outsider. Nicodemus comes to Jesus from his home in the middle of the night, presumably where he had a comfortable bed in which to wrestle with what was on his soul. This woman is in the middle of her chores, lugging heavy jars of water, bound to a rhythm and to relationships she did not choose. Theology was probably the last thing on her mind. And yet Jesus meets them both right where they are. This is the thing about Jesus that John wants us to know. There is no person, no circumstance where Jesus does not meet us. There is no place too far or too unfamiliar where he cannot find us. He does not wait for us only on mountaintops or in churches. Wherever our hunger or thirst takes us, wherever we wrestle or just need a rest, he is there. And the woman in our story needs a rest. Hers is a life of burden and heartache. The very fact that she is coming to the well alone in the heat of the day gives us a clue about that. For the rest of the women in the town would gather in the cool of the morning or the evening to do this chore. But she is not welcome then. She is not part of their community. Most likely she has had a difficult life, experiencing the kind of hardship and pain that has made her a source of gossip around that well. In her conversation with Jesus, we learn that she has had 5 husbands and is not married to the man she's currently living with. Many smug interpreters have drawn the conclusion that there's something shady or tawdry about that. It's the same kind of unfounded smear campaign that painted Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. But the reality of first century life for women is that it was tragically insecure. This woman could have easily been widowed or abandoned or divorced for reasons over which she had no control. Losing 5 husbands would be heartbreaking, but not impossible. The man she is currently living with could be a relative who took pity on her, an employer, or a master who took her in. There are many ways to see this story as tragic rather than scandalous. The lens we use is up to us. But there is nothing in Jesus' response to her that implies she bears any kind of shame for what has become of her life. The real scandal is that Jesus talks to her at all. Men weren't supposed to talk to unfamiliar women, certainly not alone. And Jews weren't supposed to talk to Samaritans. The feud between these two groups had been going on for centuries, and Samaritans were considered religiously inferior to the Jews. And yet Jesus engages this Samaritan woman in a way that dignifies her humanity, acknowledges her reality. Interestingly, Jesus' conversation with her is the longest one recorded in all the Gospels. He does not treat her like she is some faceless woman just there to fetch him water. She is a person with a past and a presence and a future, worthy of his attention, worthy of God's attention. He sees her as she is, and their mutual thirst brings them together. Being seen just as we are is both a deeply nurturing and potentially terrifying experience. If you've ever fallen in love with something, you know that mixture of ecstasy and fear. When someone knows us deeply, we feel validated. We feel like our life has value and meaning, but we also feel vulnerable. There's nowhere to hide. We cannot duck behind the curtain we have created to cover the messy parts of our lives. We wrestled with this wonderful paradox during our forgiveness class last Wednesday night. We all shared Psalm 139 together, that beautiful expression of God's deep knowledge of us, which begins, "Oh God, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from far away. For it was you who formed my inward parts, you who knit me together in my mother's womb. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret." How soul-quenching to believe that we are held that intimately in the mind and heart of God. And yet, how overwhelming. For if God sees all of us, God also sees those parts of us that are broken and flawed and ego-driven, the parts that we don't want to look at in ourselves. How could God possibly love us when God really sees us for who we are? The woman at the well was holding on to that same question. Those jars she carries are not just heavy with water, they are full of doubts and hesitations and regrets and pain. They keep her burdened with a life of invisible toil and loneliness. But when Jesus sees her and speaks to her, his deep awareness of her life lifts her burden and opens her eyes. She recognizes him as someone who can take her deeper than the limits of the life she has known. He can break through divisions, and he can heal her wounds. He can quench her thirst with water that needs no bucket to carry. Do you trust that God can really love you for who you are? This is the question that we carry, especially during this season of Lent. The question dares to get behind the fiction of our lives that we have created and invites us to step into the gaze of God. Who are we really? How do our lives align with the dream of God for us and for all of creation? How can the brokenness and pain of our past be brought into the light of day that we may truly be seen and known and heard? Is there a source of living water that we can drink from that can heal us? One way that ancient Christians engaged in this kind of healing soul work is through what's called an examination of conscience. It was a practice that was begun by St. Ignatius of Loyola, who constantly wrestled with his own questions of worthiness. Each evening he found a place of quiet solitude, and he opened his heart and brought to mind the events of the day. He recalled where he had failed a relationship, given in to selfishness, betrayed a friend or a principal. He also recalled where he had healed a wound, offered a hand, remembered to be grateful. He examined his life just as it was, the good and the bad, the dark and the light, putting it all before God in its mundane beauty and mess. He allowed himself to be seen for his whole self, and he allowed himself to be loved by God just as he was. After our session ended on Wednesday night, we invited ourselves to participate in a practice of that kind of examination of conscience ourselves each evening, to end our day by placing before God and before ourselves all of the day. And I invite you to take a moment perhaps each evening during this season and do the same, and see if you don't feel yourself opening up to the healing light of God. For as frightening as this honest confrontation can be, it is also deeply liberating to bring our pain and heartbreak and guilt out from the recesses of our souls and into God's light, and to learn that God can and will love us through all of it, releases the burdens that so many of us carry. The woman who came to Jesus was weighed down not just with buckets, but with a past she couldn't escape. As a woman, perhaps betrayed and abandoned, and as a Samaritan that was considered untouchable in the Jewish culture, she thirsted for real connection, for forgiveness, for grace, for new life. But she was convinced that none of that was available to her. She felt invisible and in her community and in her own heart, and it was a particularly lonely place to be. Her longing is echoed by another woman whose painful past exiled her from her home, our poet, Julia Esquivel. As an advocate for peace in a war-torn land, Esquivel knew what it felt like to be rendered invisible. As she watched death squads and government forces decimate villages, creating scores of widows and orphans, her cries fell on deaf ears, and her protests resulted in exile. And yet she knew that hope and wholeness can only be found in God. In the poem that Travis shared with us this morning, that longing to be at one with God's dream, that thirst for a life and a world of wholeness and peace is palpable. At the end of the poem, she asks, what glory, what other glory could soothe a soul that is thirsting for all that only you are? Our woman at the well may not have faced the same kind of violence and political heartbreak that Esquivel did, but she shared the same kind of thirst to be seen, to be known, to be liberated from the pain of the past. Thirsting is a good thing. It brings us closer to God, and it brings God closer to us. When the woman offers Jesus a drink, she experiences an encounter with God that quenches her dry soul, and it changes her life. She once called Jesus a prophet, but now she has become prophetic herself. She has found the source of living water, and she cannot keep it to herself any longer. She must share it with the world, and so she leaves her bucket behind, and she begins a new life. Water and thirst, daylight and night, hidden truth and eyes opened wide. This season we are offered many images to prime our spiritual pump and to open our hearts. We are invited to bring our whole messy, flawed, broken selves before God that we might be seen and liberated too. May we learn to let go of all we hide behind, all that keeps us bound to our pasts, and find the courage to become truly visible, the courage to open our own eyes, daring to recognize Jesus when we see him. For he is there, waiting for us no matter where we are, offering us a deep drink of the kind of water that will never dry up. And as we gain practice in surrendering our pasts and our present and our burdens over to him, may we also grow in faith and in confidence, in time leaving our own buckets behind, opening our eyes, seeing and being seen, and sharing with the world all that God has done for us. For thanks be to God. Amen.